Abrams, who is an EOS implementer, just a great entrepreneur and just a great human overall. So great to have you here, Matt.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be here.
Well, we were chatting a little bit before we got started. You are in Asheville, North Carolina, right? Give the general area.
Yep.
So if you could just tell us your entrepreneurial story, how did you become an implementer? And you can start from the beginning. I mean, you can start from the very, very beginning if you like. It's your choice.
Sure. I probably won't start with my grandparents, although that's an interesting story, but we won't fit it in here. Um, so my entrepreneurial story really began, the short version is in my 20s, I started a little contracting company, and that really just bankrolled me traveling. That was really it. In my early 20s, and I was a travel writer and a photojournalist, and I traveled to about 40 countries doing freelance work. And then in that hands-on experience with the world, that was like, I learned more in 1 year traveling than I did in 16 years in the classroom. And I was just like, oh my gosh, education, I think we can do better, at least for some of us. So I got really involved in kind of like the alternative education movement, and really starting to ask the question, like, what is the purpose of education? And what I came to, and just kind of like sitting with that question for a while, was the purpose of education is to create the conditions for us to understand our, like as Dan Sullivan would say, like our unique ability, our calling, the genius that exists within us, and then gives it a container to be realized out in the world, like at a very fundamental level. So then I said, okay, well, I want to create a program for that. And it was really initially for like gap year, like 18 to 25-year-olds, to help that cohort like understand their purpose and go out there. And then it turned into, like, through a lot of iterations, an intergenerational incubator for purpose-driven entrepreneurs.
Hmm.
So intergenerational is pretty self-explanatory. We had participants from 16 years old to 87 years old in the program. And purpose-driven entrepreneurs, meaning they want to make a positive impact in the world, and they want to use the vehicle of business to do it.
Mhm.
So we applied a kind of different framework from maybe like a traditional shareholder model, or profit-driven model. But how do we have multiple stakeholders in which we're delivering value to all of those stakeholders? So I founded that in my late 20s and ran that for about 7 years. And it was a 3-month program, a little in-person retreat at the beginning, and then go out and do your stuff in the world, and 3 months later for a closing retreat. And we would pair our entrepreneurs with one-on-one coaches. They would be in a practice group, like an EO forum you can think
Mhm.
about. And then thought leaders, professionals, and experts. And the whole intention was to leadership developments, or cultivating and building the capacity of the leader and the vision, and like their entrepreneurial or their enterprise, their vision for that. So ran about 250 people, entrepreneurs, through that program over the course of 7 years. Probably about in year 5, one of our entrepreneurs had a brother who was in EO, and said they're looking for a facilitator to lead their annual retreat. Is that something you'd be interested in? I had never heard of EO. This is like
Mhm.
15 years ago. I was like, that sounds cool. And I did it. And I was like, I was nervous because it was, totally over my skis there. But they loved it, and they loved me, and they're like, you're our guy. And I was like, oh my gosh, like maybe I'm good at this. And and I loved it. And and then so I started doing that for I just probably a few retreats a year. And then I went to get certified for EO IPO facilitation, and I met a handful of EOS implementers there. This is probably 8 or 9 years ago.
Mhm.
And they were talking about, EOS has like changed my life, and it's the best thing ever. And I was like, uh-huh, whatever. Like, I doubt that. Like, I can't imagine this like one thing that fits all companies. All companies are different and unique. And thinking about my company, and like there was not a plug and play thing. And anyways, so I was a little curious, but definitely skeptical. And then I was still facilitating EOYPO, and then a lot of these entrepreneurs started to talk about EOS, and I was like, all right, so maybe this is really having a positive impact. I should at least be curious, just to do my due diligence in the field, at least learn more about it. So I started reading Traction, and I realized how dysfunctional my business was. And this is not a new story. This happens like all the time, and I hear my clients like tell this story all the time. But that was it for me. And we had two visionaries. We had no vision. We had two visionaries with no vision. We had very little accountability. Like in the 6 components, we were terrible. Like we talk about starting at 20%, we're probably like 7%. So it had gotten so bad within my company that there was such a fracture between the other visionary and me that it was just a painful experience. And that business wound up folding. And then this was pre-franchise, so I was, a member of Basecamp, and I had an entrepreneurial buddy here in Asheville. I said, hey, look, I've never done this before, implementing EOS, but I'll do it for, not too expensive. I think it'll work, but he said, sure, let's do it. So in 3 months, he had like really significant benefits within his business. And I was like, all right, maybe there's something here. And then I probably had 8 clients before I went to boot camp, because I really wanted to be part of a community. That was a really important thing to me. And and that was probably 70 clients ago. And I mean, I love it. I'm so happy now. I'm just like, I feel like I found my tribe, and I feel like I found my calling, and it's really helped me grow personally in incredible ways. So, that's the probably more like 7-minute. Not that
Well, that's okay.
but so that's where I am now, and I'm working on a book and on leadership and integrity and conflict, and that'll be out in the spring. But that's kind of like my entrepreneurial journey.
That's awesome. So tell me, your contracting company, so you started that in your 20s. Now, when you're doing freelance work, were you still doing the contract company at the same time?
When I
Or
was
did
doing
you
the travel
sell
work?
that, or yeah.
Oh no, there was no selling that. That was like me hiring a couple of my buddies to paint my girlfriend's mom's house. Like jobs like that. And then they would
Gotcha.
be like, oh, like he's a sweet kid and we need this done. And I would just, sometimes the jobs would be 2 or 3 weeks, but it was just like light plumbing, light electrical, house painting, put in a tile floor, like handyman stuff. Like,
Sure.
and so no, there was no selling that business. It probably wasn't worth anything. It was just me doing jobs. I was
Right.
living in New York City actually, and I started like another iteration of that called Rent a Husband.
Okay.
So I have some stories there. We got to go down that path.
I would guarantee, yes, I'm sure you have. So
Yeah.
rent a husband, I mean, that's like an invitation
I didn't
to
really think
have
about
awkward
that at the time.
conversations.
I didn't put 2 and 2 together. It's just like, your husband should do these things, but he might not be, and I don't know. So, learning.
Right. So that was like a naming mistake, maybe,
That
or
was
maybe not a mistake. I don't know.
some people got it. Some people didn't. Let's just say that.
Yeah. Right. That's hilarious. Terrible name.
Okay.
Well, I mean, it depends on what business you're in, I guess.
This would be the perfect name for a different business.
Right. That's right.
It's not in the mail escort business. Let the listeners know that
That was unintentional,
that was
implied
just
consequence.
being young and dumb and understanding.
Yeah. That's great. So you when you were traveling, you were doing freelance photography and writing and things like that. What was your favorite country? What was like your biggest lesson from that time?
Yeah, well, favorite country is really hard. I would need some more criteria to answer that. I will say,
Yeah.
New Zealand is a pretty beautiful country. The people are amazing. The just lifestyle feels really different and really beautiful. I would say Cuba is probably, if I had to kind of like integrate all the different variables of what favorite is, I would say that would be my favorite. Aesthetically, it was so beautiful. It was incredibly complex, which I really appreciated.
Hmm.
I would often, when I would travel, I would become embedded within the culture. So I was like, I lived on the Blackfoot Reservation in Montana, living with an indigenous family and participating in indigenous ceremonies and herding cattle on horseback. And I did that kind of thing in most of my travels, was becoming really embedded. So I could, I wouldn't say understand the culture, because, I can't do that in 5 weeks, but I can have a deeper appreciation for it
Sure.
than just being like on the outside looking in. So I was living with a Cuban family, and one of the guys in the family, he and I became really close, and we would just talk about like Cuba and America and communism and capitalism,
Hmm.
and it wouldn't always be so like theoretical, but we came with like a grow or die mindset, and that we weren't trying to like defend. Like I wasn't an ambassador for the United States. He wasn't an
Right.
ambassador for Cuba. We're not trying to like convince one another. We're just curious. And I was talking to him about like, this answers your question, like what was most impactful. Like I got my first job was when I was 11, and I would go over to my neighbor's house, and they were an elderly couple, and I would mow the lawn and, scrub their astroturf like deck area, and just like odd jobs. You see, rent a husband started back then.
That's right.
Rent a neighborhood kid. So I would tell him that story, and I would tell about the virtues. Like my parents would only give me like $25 toward shoes, but if I wanted nicer shoes, and shoes were a big deal when you're 12 years old, I had to make up the difference. So I learned a lot of like financial responsibility and autonomy and independence, and these are all virtues. These are all great things. And then he would say, that's so fascinating, because when we're 11, like it's your time to play, and we play baseball, and we're playing like, all hours of the day, and the weekends it's play, 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 because that's your time to be a kid. Like, why would you be working then? And that made total sense to me too. And we were able to just see and appreciate that it isn't this either or zero sum game. There's like, we all come from our places and our stories, and our stories make sense given our context and our experience. And then, so that has really been helpful for me throughout all of my life. And even in the session room, there, we all as EOS implementers have the times where there's that one person on the leadership team where it's just like, oh my God, like, what are you doing? Give me a break. Just like, what is going on? And it's given me like a tremendous reservoir of patience and appreciation to just be curious and know that this person has their own unique story, and how they grew up, and the different wounds that they have, and the day that they're having, and what else is going on in their life. And just to be more curious and more compassionate. I think that would probably be the biggest impact that I had, rather than to just kind of see things and have a confirmation bias and put things into a box. I
Sure.
have that, and then I kind of pause, and I'm curious about that.
Right. Right. Yeah. Traveling just provides that kind of experience, and being somewhere for 5 weeks, I think that probably gives you enough time to really get a sense of what's happening, especially if you're not like traveling inside of that one place and sightseeing and things and just
Right.
experiencing that. That's awesome. So how did you go from travel writer, photographer, to working with entrepreneurs? And you said it got you interested in education
Mhm.
and the educational system, but how did it go to educating entrepreneurs?
Yeah. Um, it started with purpose. It started with like using education as a vehicle to help us understand our purpose. But I realized that that was only half of the puzzle. Understanding what our purpose is really important, but unless we do anything with
Hmm.
that, it's unrealized potential.
Yeah.
So when I started to think about designing this curriculum, uh, to help, creating the conditions to help the participants understand their purpose, it was there's a phenomenon, it's a pedagogical phenomenon called praxis, which is basically you learn something and then you do something and then you reflect and then it's like a postmortem. Yeah. And we look at, what did I learn? What worked well? What didn't? Just, that general postmortem. And then you kind of think again and then act again. And it's an upward spiral of think, act, reflect, integrate, do.
Yep.
That kind of just continual cycle. So I realized like that was the missing part in a lot of like taking a test isn't doing, right? Like, I mean, first of all, I just want to say the kind of like traditional education in a classroom really does work very well for some people. So I'm not, degrading that. I think
Right.
it didn't work for me, and it didn't work for a lot of entrepreneurs, because we need to do stuff. So that was the initial like, well, we need to do, and then it was like, well, initially like these participants will come together and start a collective business together, and it'll be over the course of a year, and then the next cohort will come in and run that business and evolve that way. And then I realized that we were just getting these applications from people who had their own thing that they wanted to start.
Mm-hmm.
So we just shifted it to say, we're going to help you clarify your values, your purpose, your unique ability, and then make sure that what you're creating has that embedded in the DNA. So that was the evolution, to go from discovering purpose to using creation as a vehicle to help in the purpose discovery process.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So you really were just listening to your customers that happened to show up at your door, and you're like, "Hey, we can serve you, and this is how we're going to do it."
Yeah, rather than, and I think I was not as young and dumb as the rent-a-husband phase, but I was also pretty inexperienced and kind of like, I made so many mistakes, and I was like, it's got to be perfect, and you have to have it all figured out. And so there were some things where we were able to be receptive to ideas and iterative in that process. But that was one of the things that we did well, was listening to
Yeah.
that, evolving the program.
Right. I mean, it is such a novel concept to ask your customers what they want and then give it to them. I mean, it's just kind of strange.
Right, I know. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Right.
They-
Yeah,
they-
I think that's it's interesting, as you mentioned, praxis, because we think about a few things around, and one of the reasons I was always drawn to EOS is the EOS process. You go do a focus day, you learn some things, then you go away, you try it out, you bump your head, skin your knee, and then you get cleaned up on vision building day one, so forth and so on. That's kind of this rinse, wash, and repeat. I like the way you described it as an upward spiral. And that pedagogy of how we've built EOS, how Gino built it, and hopefully we're continuing it, is we don't teach you everything, because there's things that we can teach you and there's things you need to learn on your own. And of course, having the wisdom to know the difference is that's a trick, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and that's why grow or die is such a core component to the values mix, right? Because we need to be in that iterative evolutionary process to be able to grow and become better and better. It's we can have 300 sessions or 500 sessions or 1,000 sessions, but if we're not evolving in that, you can have 300 sessions and be much more masterful than having 1,000 sessions and being in stasis when it comes to learning. So that has always been something that has, it kind of sucks, to be honest. Like, everything is learning and you're never there. I mean, that's definitely a mindset. I mean, a gap mindset, rather than like, oh, what an amazing opportunity to like be a lifelong learner and continue to get better and never get there. And that's clearly what I choose. And it is so valuable, and it is really embedded into the EOS process.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I
you
think
get
that
really
resonates.
used to being uncomfortable. You
That's
get really
it.
used to being uncomfortable.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that resonates with me too, just because I was homeschooled throughout high school, so from ninth to 12th grade.
Yeah.
And I didn't go to college the traditional way. I went later. multiple times.
Uh-huh.
And it's funny because my homeschool experience was really that we would learn a little bit, and then my brother and I would just go do it. Like let's just go figure this thing out. And so it was very hands on. We created a furniture company because we were like let we were studying shaker, like the shakers, the
Right.
kind of,
Yeah.
and they had a very specific style of furniture. Like let's go build their furniture. So we did. I just think that's really important that people definitely lose sight of. Like you really only learn by applying it and doing it and that loop.
That's right. And contextualizing it, like that question of why. Like, why am I learning this? Am I learning it to
Right.
pass the test? Am I learning it because it's part of the, state articulated curriculum? Like that doesn't resonate as a learner. And I
Hmm.
think us as like EOS implementers, I mean, we think about what is it? Context, content, conclude. We can't go
Right.
content, conclude, content, conclude. We're
Yeah.
missing the why. The why is everything. Without the why, so you and your brother had, a motivation. I want to, whatever it was, I like working with my hands. I want to learn how to build stuff. I want to learn how to run a business. I love working with you. This is really cool. Whatever it was,
Hmm.
and you did the learning and the lifting to understand, well, what's the container in which we could do this? Oh, we could start a furniture company. Um, you could have, in a two-dimensional way, learned all the things, but
Right.
wouldn't, they wouldn't like, become integrated. So, yeah.
Right.
Anyways,
That's
um,
awesome.
yeah.
That's awesome. So working with your clients now, what are you seeing clients struggle with? How are they breaking through those ceilings? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's kind of two layers to this as I see it. I really like this question because I've never really thought about it in this way. Um, the work that I'm doing and have been doing for the past 6 years around researching and writing and interviewing for this book that I'm going to be publishing really looks to more of a psychographic or intrinsic motivation component of the work, and the work that we do with EOS and the process and the tools um, is looking at more of a structural. And these are both really important. So I'm giving some context here to hopefully this will make some sense in that I'm learning the struggles are actually on two dimensions. One dimension is this notion of hitting the ceiling, right? Like, oh, things are more complex than they need to be. We're not doing a good job delegating. We're putting out a lot of fires. We're not being effective at predicting. So the five leadership abilities and the five dysfunctions, not to be confused with Lencioni's work, but the five dysfunctions that come as a consequence of not adhering to those five leadership abilities. So those are very common, and I can certainly share a couple that have been on repeat with my clients. And then on the other level is um, belief systems and self-limiting stories within individuals and actually within teams. So these are different blind spots that we have as individuals and we have as teams. So it's looking at systems like a human, a leader is a system, a leadership team, of course, is a system. There are things that we're great at, there are things that we're not so great at, but there are things that we could be great at if we saw the reality, but we don't see the reality. So these are deeper, more nuanced things about just like, for example, I think it's probably easier to make it through example. So one of the things that I notice at a organizational level is we suck at delegating, and we create these stories. We don't have enough money to hire this person, or um, we like I can do it better, or it's not the highest priority, or whatever. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. So here's an example of when it's not. Um, there's and this is, I'm saying this specific example, but I see this often. A woman on the leadership team, she was the integrator and head of finance. And she kept saying, I don't want to be head of finance. So she got it, she didn't want it, and she had the skills and experience. She had the capacity. For 2 years, she was in both seats. And it was always on the long-term issues list. And every time I would really be like, we need to move this to the short-term issues list. This needs to be a rock. And I realized I started to become more like consultant because I was just like frustrated because she would be complaining and be dealing with consequences and symptoms of her not having enough capacity. I'd be like, please, for the love of God, like, let's address this. And instead of doing that, this one quarterly, I just checked in with her, like, in the session and said, why are you in these two seats? And the usual tropes came up. And then I said, what's the story behind that? And we just spent a little time in coaching. I had my coaching hat on and kind of like applying the 5 whys. And what we actually got to was she had always had to prove herself as a child. She was like never enough. Like she got A's but not A pluses. And why didn't you get an A plus? Like as she was growing up from her parents. And she realized that the story she was telling herself is that if she were only in one seat, she wouldn't be enough. She needed to be in those 2 seats to be carrying more than was expected of her and do a good job in the more that was expected of her to embody a sense of self-value. And once we got to that, there was like a collective light bulb that went on in with the rest of the team,
Right.
where they're just like, I love you and thank you for trying to do this Herculean task, but you're actually hurting the company and you are enough and you can be happier in the integrator seat, and we can find someone. We don't have unlimited money, but we weren't really understanding what was going on, but now we do, and now we can do something about it. So that is where I find, like, like Carl Jung said, until we make the subconscious conscious, we will kind of, I don't remember the exact quote, but we'll kind of like keep complaining about our reality and just call it fate.
Yeah.
Because there's these unconscious things that are creating the conditions for the thing we say we don't want. So that's something that I've noticed, that when we can peel things back, so really looking at the chronic issues that show up over and over and over again, that they can't, or they feel like they can't get to the root of, feeling like you can't get to the root of it and not being able to get to the root of it are very different. So they might feel that way, and that's one of the things that I've realized, like, our role as implementers is to slow things down and really peel that back. So that's one thing. Another issue I think is pretty common, this is, different within the leadership teams, is people hang on to bad people for too long. It's just like, it's not bad enough. What are we gonna do? The job market's thin. This is a unique position. It would be so hard to find, whatever story. And, open and honest, like, sometimes I'm in a session, like, maybe it does make sense for you to keep this person. I don't really know, and I haven't had enough experience. I have definitely kept, in companies that I ran, kept not right people, so I get it. But I think, maybe 15-20% of the time they probably should keep that person for a little while longer at least, but I think probably 80% of the time it's just it's hard.
Probably right.
I really like this person. They're not that bad, but I think this notion of tolerating, I have a lot of companies and clients that they'll tolerate a process being pretty good but not completely up to date, an accountability chart that's visited semi-annually but not appropriately, and they tolerate the consequences. So in all different areas, I think a lot of my clients, that's probably the biggest issue, is they're not taking time to take an inventory of what is it that we're tolerating right now, and being intentional around that. Like, are we really willing to tolerate it? Because if we are, odds are we're not really committed to being our best.
And I think that there's an implied what you tolerate, you endorse, because your teams are always looking at your behaviors. They're looking at what you're tolerating as well. And I think that has knock-on effect of, well, I guess if they can get away with that, I can too.
Totally.
Or maybe that's what's expected of me, even though it's not. So you end up with all of these different types of behaviors inside of a business that that tolerating just implodes on you.
That's right. I think I heard somewhere, as goes the leadership team, so goes the rest of the team.
It might have been said a few times.
I think so. Maybe more than seven.
Yeah.
And that's it, right? Like there's an embodied way of being that becomes the norm. And if it's healthy, that's great. And if it's dysfunctional, that's not great. I think I heard this from Pat Lencioni or someone at the table group. If there's, this is more on vision, but it's very similar. But if there's a mist in the pulpit, there's a fog in the pew. So if we're a little bit off as a leadership team, we're not totally embodied in the vision, for example, and the strategy to achieve that vision, or like these more nuanced things, if we're a little bit off here, it just gets amplified throughout the rest of the organization. So I think
Yeah.
when we tolerate something at the top, it just expands throughout the organization. And that's what I do see.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Matt, I think we'll come to a close here. Do you have any parting thoughts? It's been great. I think a lot of people get value out of the conversation and what you're seeing in your story. Any parting words?
Parting words, I would just say, we recently had a hurricane here in Western North Carolina, and it was an incredibly hard, challenging time for our family, the EOS implementers here in Western North Carolina, our families, and the community at large. And I want to just acknowledge how generous and help firsty the EOS community is. So this is a kind of a two-parter. One is just from the bottom of my heart, like a thank you to this community. It was truly remarkable and lifted us up when we needed it, and that was not expected, but I just was kind of overwhelmed by how beautiful this community was, and also an invitation for us as a community that use it, lean in when we need help, like be vulnerable, let yourself be seen. It's a way to, really deepen the connections and the fabric of our community, and it's a hard thing to do. But if we can model that, I'm just so confident that we will endure, and our core values will endure, and the relationships will endure, and we'll have something real and something incredibly special. So a little PSA at the end of this conversation.
All right.
Like, yeah, we do have something special, and just really naming that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. All right, Matt. Well, it was good having a chat with you, and we'll see you. Till next time.
Thanks, Mark. Good chatting with you too.
All right, so if you can hang out here just a little bit, it's got to finish its uploading. Yours is still